welcome everyone to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs, with Nigel Ashton from the London School of Economics on Missed Opportunities for Peace, the United States, Jordan, and the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Let me just say, as always, that we're profoundly thankful to the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations for sponsoring this seminar, the Washington History Seminar, which is, of course, co-organized by the National History Center and the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and which I'm delighted to co-chair, as always, with Professor Roger Lewis. Nigel has, we managed to take advantage of his trip here for a conference we did last week on the history of the Iran-Iraq War. Some of you might have seen the New York Times coverage of some of the documents that were released at the conference, on the occasion of the conference. So Iran-Iraq War last year. Today it's Jordan and the Arab-Israeli War. Nigel is Professor of International History and, in fact, chairs the International History Department at the London School of Economics, specializes in Anglo-American relations and the history of the modern Middle East. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, had a number of positions, including at the University of Liverpool. Before, in '98, he moved to the London School of Economics. His major work relating to today's talk is King Hussein of Jordan, A Political Life, which analyzes the role of the late king in shaping Middle Eastern statecraft throughout the second half of the 20th century, subject that's obviously of great relevance today and has attracted interest since Nigel has been one of the very few to have access to the royal archives in Jordan. So he might also add a footnote or two to his talk about archival access in writing on the subject. His other books include Kennedy, Macmillan, and the Cold War, The Irony of Interdependence, published in 2002, and Eisenhower, Macmillan, and the Problem of Nasser, Anglo-American Relations and Arab Nationalism, 1955 to 1959, published in 1996. Roger, anything you'd like to add by way of introduction?
Well, that was a very full introduction, Christian. You've left me with virtually nothing to say, but I will say a word about Nigel within the context of the London School of Economics. It used to be, perhaps still is, that people at LSE regarded themselves as at the very center of the intellectual universe. And at the center of this was the Department of International History. This is the way it was traditionally regarded, and so this is quite a legacy just to maintain within the LSE itself. We do have a ritual, and we'll ask everyone to identify themselves. If you would say where you're from, why you're from there, I guess, and if you like a word about the LSE.
My name is Stephen Shore. I work for the PBGC, and I'm from there because it enables me to come here just 3 blocks away.
Yeah.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Scholar.
Northern Illinois University.
Kaivig, a former fellow here.
Arnita Jones, Director Emerita from the American Association.
Former fellows and India watchers. Add a PS. Not interested in the Middle East, but I know first.
Okay.
Extreme Public Policy Program here at the center.
Pass it to the ladies in the back there.
I'm Luciana De Benedetti, Scholar Intern here at the Wilson Center.
Corinna Tia, Scholar Intern at the Wilson Center.
Mona Musavi, Intern at the Wilson Center.
Courtney Jolene, Intern with the Wilson Quarterly.
Okay, let's turn that one off, and then hopefully by the time we get to Q&A, we'll have a functioning mobile phone. Anyhow, it's a great pleasure to welcome back to the center. We launched, actually, his King Hussein book here. Welcome back. We're thrilled to have you, Nigel, and it's over to you.
Well, thanks for those very kind introductions. Can everybody hear me okay on this? Yeah, good. This is a slightly unusual paper about the 1967 war for two main reasons. The first thing is it focuses on the role of an individual, which I would imagine probably no one in the room, or whom I would imagine probably no one in the room has heard of. And that individual is Jack O'Connell, who is the CIA station chief in Amman, Jordan, between 1963 and 1971. It's also unusual because it focuses more on the role of the United States and Jordan in the outbreak of the war. Most focus in terms of the outbreak of the war has been on the role of Egypt and Israel, rather naturally, since they were the main protagonists. So it's unusual for both of those reasons. Let me tell you, first of all, a little bit about the individual who's at the heart of the paper and why I've come to write something about him and why I'm talking to you about him today. Who was Jack O'Connell, and why should we take seriously the claims that he made about the outbreak of the 1967 war? Well, Jack O'Connell, who died last year, I would argue, was actually a rather unique and remarkable figure in terms of the contemporary history of United States involvement in the Middle East. As CIA station chief in Jordan between 1963 and 1971, he established a closer personal relationship with King Hussein of Jordan than any other foreigner before or since. But not only that, in a unique combination of roles, once he left the CIA in 1972 to join his brother's law firm in Washington, D.C., he went on to take up the role of King Hussein's attorney at law in the United States, and at the same time acted as a sort of informal diplomatic advisor to King Hussein of Jordan, regularly preparing briefing papers for the king when he made his frequent visits to Washington, D.C. So I think you could argue that O'Connell actually combined three roles during what was a really rather remarkable career over the course of 4 decades. He was first of all spy, and then attorney and diplomat. And moreover, he exercised influence on and from both sides of the US-Jordanian relationship, also rather unusual. Well, as I said, wouldn't expect anyone in the room to know who he is, and in fact, he's been almost completely absent as well from historical study of the region in this period. There's one very brief mention of his role in the memoirs of the CIA director at the time, Richard Helms. And there's also a brief mention of his role, of course, in my book. That's what you'd expect, because I'm sat here talking about him, so of course he's in my book. He's also in Avi Shleim's biography of King Hussein of Jordan, called Lion of Jordan. And interesting to note, a little bit more volume, interesting to note that Avi Shleim has, I would say, really rather similar opinion of him to that of mine. So let me quote what Avi has to say about him. He said that O'Connell, quotes, had a closer relationship with King Hussein than any other American official before or after, unquote, and that he was, quotes, a man of complete integrity, unquote. But beyond those sort of scattered references, I think you could say that O'Connell's almost complete absence from the literature is a pretty good illustration of Chris Andrews' long-standing complaint that the study of intelligence often forms the sort of missing dimension of the mainstream study of diplomatic history. Well, of course, there are good reasons why he's not there in the history. One of the main reasons, of course, as with any other intelligence officer, is the difficulty in accessing reliable sources. Again, as is often the case with intelligence officers, there's no substitute when you're discussing O'Connell's role to placing considerable reliance on his own personal testimony, whether that's testimony delivered in his posthumously published memoir called King's Counsel, or whether it's through oral history. And it's principally on the latter of those elements, the oral history element, that I will be relying here, because between 2002 and 2010, I conducted 6 long oral history interviews with O'Connell, the last of which took place only a couple of months before his death in July 2010. Well, these interviews were very full, and they became, I think, increasingly revealing over time as we got to know one another. But of course, one can't purely rely on these things because, oral history on its own, as everyone knows, has some major methodological problems associated with it. So what I've done, and what I'll show a bit in this paper, is I've carefully cross-checked various claims that O'Connell made against the available documentary sources. And out of all of these sources, I would say I found probably State Department records the most useful in helping to substantiate some of O'Connell's claims. O'Connell is often there in State Department records, either referred to directly as Embassy Officer O'Connell, obviously not in terms of his real function, but Embassy Officer O'Connell, or sometimes there's simply an embassy officer referred to whose frequent meetings with King Hussein tally up pretty closely with what O'Connell himself claimed later. And what I did find when I cross-checked as much of what he said as I could was that in almost all cases he seemed to be a very reliable witness. This is backed up, of course, as well by Avi Shlaim's view of O'Connell. Right, so what did O'Connell claim after that rather lengthy introduction to who he was and why it matters? What claims did O'Connell make about the outbreak of the 1967 war that are significant? There are 2. And I would argue that the first of the 2, if you like, is probably the more strongly founded because it concerns events in which O'Connell personally played a direct role as CIA station chief in Amman. And specifically, this claim concerns a warning that O'Connell says he passed to King Hussein of Jordan, which he'd received via a back channel on the evening of the 4th of June about the Israeli plan to attack Egypt at 8 a.m. the following morning, June the 5th. And according to O'Connell, I'll go into this in more detail in a moment, he advised King Hussein directly to stay out of the war at this point. This is the night before it breaks out, and predicted that the Arabs would lose the war. The second claim, perhaps slightly less well-founded, simply because it's derived at second hand, but still I think well worth discussing because it relates to a well-established historiographical debate about the United States' role in the outbreak of the war. The second claim concerns the so-called green light, which President Johnson is supposed to have given to the Israeli government for the attack on Egypt on the 5th of June. And O'Connell's version of this is largely based on conversations he held with Director of Central Intelligence, Dick Helms, after they'd both left the CIA. But he does produce, and I'll talk about this in a minute, he does produce some documentary evidence for this as well. So if I refer back briefly to the title of the paper then, Missed Opportunities for Peace then, well, the missed opportunities for peace considered here then are firstly King Hussein's failure to act on O'Connell's warnings and stay out of the war, and secondly, President Johnson's signaling of his acquiescence when faced with clear evidence of Israeli intention to launch a strike on Egypt. Okay, O'Connell's warnings then, the first of these claims. I would imagine most people in the room are familiar with the very basic outline of how war came in 1967. You have an escalation of tensions between Egypt and Israel, marked first of all by Nasser's movement of the Egyptian forces into the Sinai Desert on the 14th of May, then his call on the 16th of May 1967 for the removal of the United Nations Emergency Force, which had been stationed on the Egyptian side of the border with Israel since the 1956 war, and finally Nasser's announcement of the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping on the 22nd of May 1967. All of these, I think, are pretty familiar landmarks in the run-up to the outbreak of war. And there's one further familiar landmark as well, and that's King Hussein's visit to Cairo on the 30th of May, during which he signed a defense pact with Nasser, which put Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. Well, this trip on the 30th of May is an appropriate starting point, I think, for considering O'Connell's role in this crisis. Just rolling the clock back a bit, O'Connell's very first visit to Jordan was back in the summer of 1958, and he went out there with evidence of an Egyptian-backed plot against King Hussein and played a role in thwarting this plot. And from that point onwards, back in 1958, he'd always been very suspicious of Egyptian intentions regarding Jordan. So it's no surprise then that on the morning of the 30th of May 1967, that O'Connell made a fruitless attempt to try and prevent King Hussein's visit to Cairo. The way he described it, he arrived in his office that morning to find intercept evidence of conversations between the Egyptian and Syrian leadership, which led him to believe that the Egyptian invitation to Cairo was a trap and that King Hussein shouldn't make the trip. Well, O'Connell's warning, the first of his warnings, I suppose, goes unheeded, and King Hussein makes his trip to Cairo, and his room for maneuver in the subsequent crisis is fundamentally constrained by the defense treaty he reaches with Nasser at that juncture, which, as I say, puts Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. Well, more significant than this first unheeded warning is a second warning delivered by O'Connell on the 4th of June. Well, the account of this episode was related to me first, originally, in a long interview I held with O'Connell on the 23rd of October, 2008. And the story that he told ran as follows. He said that on the evening of June 4th, he was working late in his office at the embassy, when the assistant military attaché knocked on his door at about 7 o'clock that evening. And as O'Connell put it to me, he, quote, came to talk about something else, unquote, but he was really obviously preoccupied. Well, after O'Connell asked him a few probing questions, this assistant military attaché, opened up, and he said he'd received a back-channel message from a friend in the military attaché's office at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. And the message was that Israel was going to launch an air attack on Egypt at 8 a.m. the following morning. That's the 5th of June. Well, O'Connell immediately asked about his own personal brief, and that was Jordan. Was there any evidence about what Israeli intentions were in relation to Jordan? And the response from the officer was no. There was no information, but he did offer one piece of advice. And the piece of advice was that Jordan should put its air force on cockpit alert, because if the Israelis did choose to attack, otherwise the Jordanians would never get their planes off the ground. Well, what did O'Connell do? He phoned the palace straight away. He was told the king was at a private address, and he went to meet him there and passed on the information in person. And he added a further warning, and the warning was that the CIA's best estimate was that the Arabs would lose the war with Israel in about a week. So Jordan should stay out of the battle, was his firm advice. As he put it to King Hussein, quotes, "You don't have to be more Arab than the Syrians," unquote. Well, he also made it clear to the king that he was speaking on his own initiative and that he hadn't consulted Washington. Well, what happened? The war broke out on schedule. Nasser hadn't done anything. O'Connell had no idea what became of his warning. And he had no idea, for the best part of 2 decades, what had become of the warning. About 2 decades later, he's a bit vague on this point exactly when this incident took place, but it's somewhere in the mid-80s. O'Connell, by this stage lawyer for King Hussein, was invited by the king on a trip down to Aqaba on his plane. And he passed the journey. He told me the story about the journey, quite amusing. King Constantine of Greece was on the plane at the same time. So they had a long conversation about the CIA station in Athens. You know, King Constantine knew everybody in the station. They were swapping anecdotes. And then they got down to Aqaba, and King Hussein took him to one side for some reason. And it quickly became clear why. He was finally going to tell O'Connell what had happened after this warning. And Hussein told him that he had indeed passed on the warning to Nasser twice on the evening of the 4th of June via the Egyptian general commanding on the Jordanian front. That was General Abdul Munim Riyad. Well, of course, O'Connell then asked the obvious question. If you warned Nasser, why didn't he do something? Why didn't he take some preemptive action? Well, the reply to me, again, you know, let's assume this is all true for the moment, the reply to me sums up, if you like, the tragedy of the Arabs, because Hussein said this was the first thing that he asked Nasser when the two men met in private in Cairo on the 11th of July 1967. Why didn't you react to the warning? And Nasser's reply was very simple. I didn't believe you. Tells us something about the lack of trust between the so-called Arab allies at this juncture. But Nasser also went on to say, well, he thought the crisis would pass. It was just a case of mutual saber rattling, and you know he hadn't been prepared in any sense for war. Okay, that's the story. How far can we substantiate it? It's a startling claim. How likely is it all to be true? Well, briefly, there's no obvious chronological objection to this account. The Israeli cabinet meeting earlier in the day on the 4th of June had given Prime Minister Eshkol and Defense Minister Dayan authorization to decide on the precise timing of the attack against Egypt. So it's feasible that this information could have been leaked to the US military attaché's office in Tel Aviv by late afternoon on the 4th of June for it to be passed on to Amman via the back channel contact described by O'Connell. Well, what other evidence, going beyond the simple chronological feasibility of this, is there? Well, there is some Jordanian evidence. There was a claim in a book that was published back in 1987 by a Jordanian historian called Samir Mutawi that King Hussein had passed on a specific warning on the evening of the 4th of June via General Riyad about the Israeli plan to attack the following day. But crucially, according to Mutawi, this information had come from the Iraqi ambassador in Amman. Well, the unlikelihood of the Iraqi ambassador in Amman being privy to information about Israel's battle plans, I think sums up the reason why no one subsequently took this claim from Mutawi seriously. If, by contrast, the channel of the information was the CIA station chief in Amman, then the claim starts to look slightly less preposterous. But more problematical than this, I think, is the question of why further US sources haven't come to light so far to confirm receipt of advance information about the Israeli plan of attack. Well, O'Connell didn't report his actions back to Washington, so it's unlikely, I would think, that cable traffic between Amman and Washington would substantiate this. Also, when he later discussed this matter with DCI Helms after they both left the CIA, Helms told him that he'd received no advance warning of the Israeli plan to attack via any intelligence channel. Helms did, interestingly, though, tell O'Connell that King Hussein had told him about this warning, but without telling Helms where he'd got the information from. Rather ironic if, in fact, it was Helms' own station chief who'd been the channel. Well, what about cable traffic between the Tel Aviv military attaché's office and Washington? Well, this gets slightly more interesting because the US military attaché in Tel Aviv in June 1967 was someone called Colonel Anthony J. Perner. Perner had been posted to Tel Aviv in 1965, and he'd evidently developed a very astute understanding of the Israeli military establishment and very good contacts in its upper echelons. Well, in the days leading up to the outbreak of war, Perner had accurately chronicled the build-up of IDF pressure for military action, and in a particularly prescient cable he sent early on the 4th of June, Perner had reported a conversation with unnamed senior Israeli officers who'd warned him, quotes, that Israel can't wait long because their existence is at stake, unquote, and that the new leaders of the government, especially Diane, wouldn't be moderate in their approach. Well, Ambassador Walworth Barber, by contrast, was reporting back from Tel Aviv at the same time that there was increasing calm and confidence, and that Diane's appointment would mean a decreasing likelihood of Israel resorting to war. So, I mean, Perna in this sense was right. But while Perna's office was evidently well informed about pressure being exerted from military circles, there's still no direct evidence, archival evidence to date, in cables sent back to Washington that it received a specific warning about the Israeli plan to attack. Of course, it remains possible that even if such information was received by Perna, that he didn't pass it back to Washington for fear of endangering the Israeli source of the information. But O'Connell, coming back to him, always firmly believed that one way or another, such an important piece of information, if it had been received by the military attaché's office in Tel Aviv, would have had to have been reported back to the president. Well, let me offer you one further piece of tantalizing, but circumstantial still, evidence. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who would have been, I think, the likely channel for any urgent information received from the military attaché's office in Tel Aviv, since we know Helms, according to his own subsequent account, didn't receive this. McNamara calls the president at 10 a.m. on Sunday, the 4th of June, which would correspond to 5 p.m. Tel Aviv time. Now, there was no other immediate crisis that day. I've checked out Vietnam, because if McNamara's got a reason to call Johnson urgently first thing on Sunday morning about anything, you're going to think it's probably Vietnam, but there's nothing going on in Vietnam that day. So there's no other immediate crisis, and LBJ is only retired, in fact, at 4 a.m. that morning. He'd been up in New York the previous night. So I think it's fair to say that Defense Secretary McNamara would have needed a very pressing reason to disturb Johnson first thing on a Sunday morning when the president only had about maybe 3 or 4 hours sleep. But there's no tape recording of that conversation. We don't know what they discussed, so it remains circumstantial evidence and no more. Well, similarly, finally, on the question of evidence, I shouldn't spend too long on this one because I've got another one to discuss, but finally on the question of evidence, the possible interception of these two putative warnings, which Hussein claimed to have passed via Riyadh to Nasser, that question, I think, must also remain open. The Israelis certainly had the ability to monitor communications between Amman and Cairo, illustrated, for instance, by their subsequent publication of a partial transcript of a phone conversation between Nasser and Hussein on the 6th of June. But whether these two putative warnings from Hussein on the 4th of June were monitored by the Israelis or by any other Western agency, I think has to remain an open question, simply because we don't have access to those sources as yet. So in sum, where are we on this claim about the warning from O'Connell to Hussein? The short answer is you can't either prove it or disprove it with the aid of any other information currently available. It is, though, I would argue, an internally consistent account given by an individual who was certainly in the position to act as he claimed. And had King Hussein acted on O'Connell's advice and stayed out of the war, the outcome, particularly in relation, of course, to the West Bank and East Jerusalem, might potentially have been very different. But King Hussein himself, crucially, believed that there was no way for him to stay out of this war at this stage. He couldn't renege on his agreement with Nasser without facing the possibility of being toppled by an internal coup. Plus, he had a sort of fatalistic attitude about the Israeli approach. He believed that one way or another the Israelis were coming for the West Bank, whatever he did. So O'Connell's warnings made no difference to that mindset. All right, how am I doing on time? I've got the second one to consider, which is now the whole green light question. This is the other aspect of O'Connell's account of 67. Well, his second major claim then concerns what transpired in Washington between the 31st of May and the 2nd of June 1967 during the visit of the Mossad chief Meyer Emmett. Well, to understand why all of this matters, we need just briefly to recap this whole question about the green light from the United States to Israel in June 1967. It's clear that calculations about the American reaction to any strike against Egypt played a central role in Israeli decision-making in the days leading up to the outbreak of war. The Israeli cabinet, Prime Minister Eshkol in particular, were anxious to avoid any rerun of the 1956 Suez War, in the aftermath of which pressure from the Eisenhower administration had forced Israeli withdrawal. And crucially, it was uncertainty about the possible American reaction which explains the Israeli cabinet's decision to delay a strike when they had debated the matter on the 28th of May. So between the 28th of May and the 4th of June, when the Israeli cabinet does approve the strike, the question of the American position had been clarified. And I would say this clarification comes principally because of Meyer Emmett's trip to Washington, during which he met Director of Central Intelligence Helms and Defense Secretary McNamara. Well, in terms of the historiography of this, I think the most convincing account that we have is one that by now is 20 years old, in fact. That's William Quant's account of this episode, originally in his article titled Lyndon Johnson and the June 1967 War, What Colour Was the Light? Well, Quant 20 years ago didn't have access to the bulk of the official documentation that we now do have access to. But what he was able to do was to have conversations, I think a lot of them off the record, with many of the high-level participants. And he also brought to this question a practitioner's understanding of how the machinery of government worked. So I think he offered a persuasive analysis. And Quant sums it up this way. He says, Johnson's position shifted in the final days before war from, quote, red to yellow, but not quite green. For the Israeli cabinet, that was enough, unquote. That's Quant's view. Well, what did Jack O'Connell bring to this question? Well, as I hinted at the outset, his understanding of this was framed largely through conversations, I think lengthy and repeated conversations he had with DCI Helms after the two of them had left the CIA. And here we can cross-reference his account with quite a few other sources. There's Helms' testimony at an oral history conference back in 1992, and there are also records of the crucial meetings between McNamara and Emmett, and Helms and Emmett. Well, briefly, what did Emmett himself say about his mission? He said he was in Washington for three reasons. He was there, first of all, to compare assessments with his counterparts in the CIA. He was there to find out if the US was planning to do anything to open the Straits of Tiran, a key Israeli concern in the run-up to war. But crucially, he was there, as he later put it at this 1992 Oral History Conference, to tell the Americans that I, Meyer Emmett, am going to recommend that our government strike. Well, the first of Emmett's two crucial meetings with the US officials was with Helms at 9:30 a.m. on the 1st of June. And these two individuals shared a long-standing acquaintance and understanding, and Emmett's view was, as he later put it, that it was now time to reap the fruit of the seeds that he'd planted years ago. Well, the way Helms described this meeting later was that we had a perfectly straightforward conversation about the situation. And he says, that weekend I sent an eyes-only memorandum to the president, which ended by saying that we had no doubt the Israelis were going to attack in a short time. Well, when the Foreign Relations volume for the 1967 war came to be published back in 2004, the record of Helms' discussion with Emmett was in fact withheld in its entirety from declassification. Subsequently, to accompany the publication in the year 2009 of Patrick Tyler's book, called A World of Trouble, a 5-page document, which I think we can fairly safely assume is the record of this conversation, was published on the National Security Archive website. Its provenance is unclear. It's simply listed as having come from a private collection. Well, in this memorandum to the president, Helms talks about Emmett and Diane as tough Israelis who are driving hard for a forceful solution with us and with their government. And he says that Diane's appointment can be interpreted as an ominous portent considering the Israelis' ability to strike with little or no warning at a time of their choosing. Well, where does O'Connell come in? In the late 1990s, O'Connell asked Helms to check out a copy of this memorandum from CIA archives so the two of them could discuss this conversation with the document in front of them. Well, Helms duly did that. He wouldn't let O'Connell copy the document, but he did let him read it and take notes on it. All of this part is not in O'Connell's book. This is what he told me personally. He said what then happened was he lost the notes that he'd made about this conversation, the document. So he had to go back to Helms again. He went back to Helms in the final year of his life. And then O'Connell drew up a memorandum, actually drew up a series of memoranda. Some refer to other Middle East issues that Helms was involved in. But the one that matters here relates to 1967. So when I interviewed him on May the 28th, 2009, O'Connell produced the original copy of this memorandum, and insofar as I could tell, the signature of Helms on the bottom of it looked genuine. There were some alterations in the text that again looked to be in the same hand, which I'm presuming was Helms's hand. So I think it's fair assumption that what he showed me was this memorandum he'd drawn up after this conversation. Now, in his posthumously published memoir, he doesn't, I think it's a pity this, he doesn't copy this document completely into the book. He just quotes excerpts from it. Anyway, what does he quote? He says there are three major claims in this memorandum that Helms signed about this conversation with Emmett. He said, first of all, that General Emmett made no claim that Egypt planned to attack Israel. Rather, Emmett dismissed Egypt's eviction of UNEF and the threat to close the states of Tehran as mere saber-rattling. Here I'm quoting from the document. Its main significance, he said, was that it gave Israel a pretext to carry out its larger mission, the destruction of President Nasser's power. That's the first thing in this memorandum. The second, the memorandum makes clear that Helms disputed Emmett's estimate the war would last 3 to 4 weeks. Helms countered the war would last a shorter time, probably around about a week. Finally, the memorandum underlines Emmett's central purpose, which, after all, Emmett himself had spoken about subsequently. He wanted to obtain a positive response from the president, whose acquiescence and political support Israel considered essential in order to keep the Soviets out of the ring. Well, we can't treat the text of this private memorandum prepared by O'Connell and signed by Helms as authoritative, I don't think, in the same way as Helms's original report of the meeting to the president. But what it does do is serve to underline further that the purpose of Emmett's mission was to secure the president's acquiescence in the face of an imminent Israeli decision to go to war. Well, a final little piece of interesting circumstantial evidence, the fact that Helms thought Emmett's message was of critical importance and should be relayed to the president immediately is backed up if you check the president's phone log. Because right after this meeting with Emmett at 9:30 on the 1st of June, at 10:20 a.m., Helms called Johnson right after this meeting. Again, we don't know what they said, but given the timing of the call, fairly reasonable assumption its subject was the conversation with Emmett. Well, Emmett's second key meeting in Washington on the 1st of June was with Defense Secretary McNamara. It was less substantive because they didn't have the same personal understanding that Helms shared with Emmett, but the core message was the same as that which Emmett had delivered via Helms. Again, according to Emmett's later account, this is quoting him, I told him that I'm personally going to recommend that we take action because there's no way out, and please don't react. He told me it was all right. The president knows that you're here, and I have a direct line to the president. Well, as Emmett reported this discussion subsequently to the Israeli cabinet that took the decision to strike, McNamara was called out of the meeting twice to speak to Johnson on the phone. And again, his recollection is confirmed directly by the president's daily diary, which logs 2 phone calls between McNamara and Johnson, one at 5:51 p.m. that day, and a second, a return call from the president to McNamara at 6:05 p.m. McNamara told Emmett that the president knew he was there and added, this is according to Emmett's account, I read you loud and clear. Well, let me give you the very final link in this chain before I move to a conclusion, because I'm aware that time is getting on here. The final link in this chain, again, something that O'Connell pointed to, and I then went to follow up in terms of the documentary record. This final link is provided by a letter Johnson sent to Eshkol on the 3rd of June. Now, if you read this letter, on the face of things, it is a simple restatement of the established American position in support of territorial integrity for all nations in the region, coupled with a pledge to continue international efforts to open the Straits of Tiran. But it does contain one sentence which O'Connell later described as, quote, sticking out like a sore thumb. And that's this sentence: "We have completely and fully exchanged views with General Emmett." Now, the interesting point about that sentence is that this was one of a number of changes to the original draft of the letter that the President made during a call he placed to NSC staffer Harold Saunders at 3:25 on the afternoon of the 3rd of June. And I went back to check the drafts of all of this, got down to quite a low level of detail in checking this. And what's interesting, if you look at the original draft of this message, you'll see that Saunders has scribbled on it twice General Emmett's name. It's as though Johnson's particularly trying to get a message across in relation to Emmett, if you look at that redraft. Right. So I think it's also worth reminding ourselves in respect of this final pre-war letter in relation, sent by Johnson to Eshkol, with what Shimon Shamir, who'd been in Israeli intelligence, albeit at a lower level, had said about what Israeli intelligence concluded that the green light from Washington would look like. Shamir said this: "We would get a message loaded with various insinuations and vague phrases, and perhaps even concluding with a few pious words cautioning Israel against taking unilateral action. But the Americans transmitting the signal would trust the Israelis to read between the lines." Unquote. So, where are we at this second major claim that O'Connell makes? Well, even without O'Connell's evidence, Quandt had already concluded that the light from Johnson was, to remind you, yellow but not quite green, and that this was sufficient for the Israeli cabinet. O'Connell's memorandum, signed by Helms, coupled with Johnson's insertion of the reference to Emmett in his letter to Eshkol, I think does shade us a little bit further over this spectrum from yellow to green. And here, syntactically, I'm rather tempted to turn the green light around and say we might not have a green light, but we've got light green. I would argue that the President's failure to stick to his earlier firm line against the use of force was, at this juncture, an important contributing factor to the Israeli decision to strike and thus the outbreak of war. And now to conclude, because I guess I'm slightly running up against the clock here, we have to be very careful with the claims made by any one individual, whoever that is, in terms of the historical record. Even if O'Connell's claim about the warning delivered to Hussein on the 4th of June is accurate, there remains the question of whether this intelligence was reported back to Washington, and if so, how it was received there. Simply because a piece of intelligence turns out to have been right in hindsight doesn't necessarily mean that it was treated as definitive at the time. And similarly, the additional evidence provided by O'Connell doesn't conclusively prove that there was a green light from President Johnson for the Israeli attack on the 5th of June. But it does, I think, move us further across the spectrum from yellow to green. And finally, given the title of the paper, what does O'Connell's evidence tell us about missed opportunities for peace in June 1967? Well, O'Connell personally made 2 attempts to keep Jordan out of the war. The first when he tried to warn King Hussein against his trip to Cairo on the 30th of May, and the second when he counseled King Hussein that he didn't have to be more Arab than the Syrians and that he should stay out of the forthcoming war on the 4th of June. Neither of these warnings made any difference to the outcome of events. King Hussein believed that he had no choice, first of all, to seek and then to stand by his alliance with Nasser, since if he attempted to stand aside, he'd most likely be toppled by a coup. He also believed, and O'Connell was never sure what the source of this belief was, but he also always believed that the Israelis would seize the West Bank, whatever he did at this juncture. These beliefs may or may not have been accurate. It is, of course, impossible to test them in hindsight. Well, O'Connell, for his part, always stuck to his view that the United States had made a major wrong turn in its policy in the Middle East in 1967. And for O'Connell, Lyndon Johnson was the arch-villain of the peace. The 1967 war remained a lifelong preoccupation for O'Connell. I got the feeling from these various interviews I did with him that it was the thing that woke him up at night for 4 decades. And once in these interviews I did with him, he made a comment about some event, something that happened, as he put it, after the war. And I didn't hear what he said properly, so I questioned him a bit further. And I asked him, which war are we talking about here? And I think his response was particularly telling. His response to that question was 1967. Was there any other?
Thank you. What a story. The floor is open for comments and questions.
Could I just ask a preliminary question or make a statement about the book? I have actually read the Jack O'Connell book, and I regard it as almost in a class by itself as revealing how the CIA actually operated, not only in Jordan, but the mechanisms and so on in the Middle East. My question, though, is about the possibility that Hussein might have backed out of the pact with Egypt. I just don't see how he could. I mean, it was already the command of the Jordan army had already been handed over to the Egyptians.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we come back to the question of what's the crucial juncture, in fact, 30th of May, when he made the trip where O'Connell, first counselled them, don't go because it's a trap on the part of the Egyptians. I think it might still have been possible for Hussein to back out. I mean, don't forget that the Syrians didn't do anything when the Egyptians got attacked. They sat and waited. All right, they weren't in quite the same position in terms of their forces under Egyptian command, but Hussein was being almost begged by his officers on the first day of the war to disregard Egyptian instructions because they knew that the moves the Egyptians wanted the Jordanian forces to make were disastrous. Jordan had only one very minor offensive operation that had been planned in and around Jerusalem. Otherwise, its basic strategy was to stay on the defensive because they knew their armored forces would be impossibly vulnerable to Israeli air attack. But, of course, that's not what the Egyptians had their forces do. They had them move forward on a broad front. It was a military nonsense, basically, what the Egyptians had them doing. So I think if Hussein had, I think the possibility was there for Hussein still to back out. Now, whether he could have survived it domestically, of course, is another matter. You see, the other factor, as I hinted in this paper, is that Hussein believes it's actually not going to make any difference if he backs out, because the Israelis, he believes, will find a pretext to attack on that front in any case. And his belief in that, I think, my reading dates back to the November 1966 raid on Samu. After that, he thinks that one way or another the Israelis are coming for the West Bank. And I'm not saying, this is not my view, this is Hussein's view. This is how he sees it at this juncture. So I don't think it's impossible he could have backed out, but it would have been extremely difficult at that stage.
Two brief questions. The first is, I've heard that there were Israeli warnings to King Hussein, which logically could have served as a pretext for having the king, having the West Bank stay clear of the fighting. And the other is, what exactly were the Jordanian war aims? In other words, let's say if the Egyptian plan had proceeded, how far west would the Jordanian forces have gone?
Yeah, you're right about the warnings. They do come through at least a couple of channels to Hussein. He was questioned about this issue. Subsequently said, I did get warnings, but it was too late by that stage. As far as I was concerned, the war had already started. We were committed. What were Jordanian war aims? Again, this is actually very difficult to say in hindsight. I mean, all their advanced military planning before this disastrous decision to adhere to the pact with Egypt on the 30th of May had been based on the assumption that if any war broke out, all they could do was try to hold on for about a week in the hopes that someone else would come in and, great powers would come in and broker a ceasefire. They had no significant offensive operation planned beyond, let's say, one minor one around Jerusalem. So quite how far they would have gone or what they would have done would have been entirely dictated by the circumstances as they evolved, I think. And of course, those circumstances never did evolve.
My understanding of the point that he just made about the Israeli warning was that the Israelis had somehow gotten word to Hussein that if you don't attack us, we won't attack you. Is this?
Yeah, it's along those lines. But again, his view is that it was too late. He was already committed.
I understand that.
But it's true that those warnings come through. I mean, we can debate what the purpose of them was. Was it, do you take them at face value and say it's a genuine attempt to keep Jordan out of the war? Or is it preparing the ground if a kind of destructive battle ensues around Jerusalem in particular to say, look, you know, we've got it on record, and we did it through the UN as well, to say we don't want fighting here, so we're not to blame for anything that might happen, particularly in and around Jerusalem. That's also a possible interpretation of what happened to that stage.
Ross?
Thank you very much. A question about sources. I'm just curious whether do we know, can we tell, do you know, did the O'Connell book go through the Publications Review Board at CIA, and are there any evident redactions? Yeah,
there are. I mean, the interviews I did with him are a lot fuller. I mean, I suppose I've got all the names as well, which he took out of the book. So I have, obviously, you'll appreciate when the book came out, I cross-checked it very thoroughly against the interviews I'd done with him. You know, and there were a lot of, I mean, the big picture's the same, of course it is, but there are an awful lot of details that then didn't make it into the book, which, you know, I was obliged, to be honest, to sit on an awful lot of this because O'Connell only spoke on background. He didn't want to be named as a source. That meant that when I got information from him, I also had to kind of dilute it in the book I wrote on King Hussein. So I was, you know, it was slightly frustrating not being able to discuss what he'd said directly. But, you know, obviously, sadly, since he's passed away, the circumstances have changed, so now I can discuss what he said more directly and obviously compare it with what came out in the posthumous memoir. That obviously was co-written as well, so he had someone come in, I mean, you know, and redraft what had been a fairly rough and ready piece originally and kind of turn it into something that could appear as a memoir.
I did find it surprising, though, that the book contains this much information about the CIA that was not censored or held back by the agency.
He had a very good lawyer. He had the best.
It's really astonishing.
Yeah, because that was one of the last conversations I had with him about that process, and he said that he had a good lawyer who was, you know, who was doing a good job.
Ed Austin?
I was at this very moment, so to speak, head in intelligence and research of the office that handled the Middle East. But I was still quite low on the totem pole. But nevertheless, we even low on the totem pole knew that Amit was in CIA and that he was there clandestinely and that he was, quote, at the time, people said, he was in direct contact with Johnson. Now, I'm not sure. I don't suppose Amit met Johnson.
No. That was the crucial thing, because if you think about this, if he actually does have a meeting directly with the president, it's going to be no. But if he had done, that would have given rise to an awful lot more speculation about, well, what's been said here? Has the president given some kind of authorization? I mean, that issue actually directly comes up after the meeting with McNamara, where Emmett kind of vaguely floats the idea. You know, he wondered whether he should speak to the president, and I think it's the deputy director of CIA who says to him at the moment, that would be the disastrous thing to do. There's no way you should have a conversation with the president. So it all goes through the channels of Helms and McNamara.
Were you allowed or given access to State Department papers and any INR papers of the time? And was there a paper that was written about the 4th of June in the middle of the night, maybe earlier, maybe the 5th, which said all the indications of military readiness come from the Israeli side, and the wait a minute, what was I going to say? Oh, and the furor, the rhetoric, was all on the Egyptian side about what they were going to do and what, and so forth and so on. Did you ever see a copy of that paper? Was it ever written?
I mean, I've seen documents saying that the Egyptians, are essentially in defensive formation. They're not ready to launch an attack. But then, I'm not a military person, but I think you can turn that around reasonably quickly if you have to. But certainly that was the posture they were in at that stage. And crucially, Nasser hadn't withdrawn any forces from Yemen. He only began to do that the day before the war broke out, which again was a strange thing if you're actually preparing for a war, because most of his best forces were in Yemen. He didn't bring them back. So I suppose I'm getting slightly far away from the main thrust, but if you ask my opinion on was Egypt preparing for a war in June, no, I think it was a disastrous piece of brinkmanship that went wrong. And what's my view of what the Israeli approach was? In essence, Dayan, in one way, links it all up. I mean, I see 3 decades of Israeli strategy from 48 through to 78 being dominated by the need to neutralize Egypt either through peace or war. And Dayan's position, he's the person who's consistent, if you like, through the whole of that period, because, of course, when it comes to Camp David, he's the one who's saying, we've got to cut this deal. Don't back out of this, because, this is going to achieve what we've wanted all along, take Egypt out of the equation, and there can't be any significant strategic threat to Israel. So in a sense, there's opportunity here. That's how I see it.
Just go further down the line. Arnita, first here. Arnita, here.
I apologize. I have a question about O'Connell's relationship with Hussein afterwards. Was this kind of out of line? Was it typical? Did he cross any boundaries? It strikes me as unusual.
I think it's highly unusual, is my sense of it. So again, I haven't done any broader study of the CIA, but I'm struggling to think of any other parallel of a situation where someone has been, a long-serving station chief. I mean, he saw out 5 ambassadors, during the time he was there, and then comes out of the agency and becomes the lawyer for the person who, in a sense, he's been the station chief, then he becomes the lawyer, then he becomes a diplomatic advisor as well. It's a highly...
He has to be changing hands.
Yeah, he obviously he's a lawyer, so he has to get paid for the work. Well, he's left CIA by that.
But his role at CIA obviously sets up this other arrangement.
Yeah.
Then take the mic.
The chief of station in Riyadh, when he left close, became a trustee of a whole series of Saudi institutions and so forth and so on, and had his own financial arrangements with the Saudis from which he profited. This is by no means secret, or I wouldn't know it.
It may also be something to do with King Hussein, because I also did some work on, if you like, O'Connell's British counterpart, the MI6 man in Amman, MI6, the British counterpart. There was also an interesting situation with him. He played a very important role, more particularly in 1970 and 1973. His name was Bill Spears. And after he left MI6, he went on to work as a consultant in Jordan on what actually turned out to be a fairly disastrous business project. But he did go into that kind of role afterwards. So there may be a kind of have something to do with King Hussein as well when he established those close relationships.
Thank you, Kenton Clymer.
My question was somewhat along the same lines as Arnett. Did Hussein know completely that O'Connell was station chief there, the CIA?
Yes, yeah, of course. Yeah, their acquaintance went right back. The first time he went out was in '58, and so King Hussein knew him going back to those days, and knew that he was CIA, and so there couldn't be any question of kind of hiding who he was.
I guess that's a larger. How did the Jordanian government view the CIA in general at that time?
One of the other bees that O'Connell had in his bonnet, and the first thing he wanted to tell me in the very first interview was all about how Bob Woodward had got it all wrong. because O'Connell was named in one of the Woodward articles. Remember, that all came out originally back in February '77 when the Carter administration was new in, and Woodward ran these stories about, the king was being paid off $1 million a year by the CIA, and O'Connell was named in the second of those stories as the bag man who took the money. And he was furious about this for decades afterwards. Mainly because O'Connell never checked the story out with him. And anyway, I think it's in his book as well, but certainly told me, and I think he told Avi Shlaim this part as well, that this story of $1 million a year for King Hussein was a kind of a conflation, because actually the great bulk of it in the 70s was being used to pay for security for the king's children at school in the United States. Out of the $1 million, the vast bulk was going to that. And the rest of it was a payment that dated right back. I think the Americans inherited from the British in Jordan, a payment basically to maintain, intelligence services, if you like, dated right back to, certainly from the American side, back to 55, 56, that far back. And it was a relatively small sum of money. It was about $14,000 a month, something like that essentially went towards intelligence purposes. But this was certainly one of the first things he wanted to challenge, the kind of the O'Connell no beef story, the Bob Woodward no beef story that came out back in 1977.
Mm-hmm. Yep, gentleman all the way in the back.
You mentioned that Hussein had assumed that Israel was going to try to take over the West Bank regardless of what happened. And of course, several years after the war, Hussein gave up any claim to the territories that Abdullah had annexed back in the 20 years earlier. Do you know what the origins of this decision to give up claim was, and could it have dated back to '67 or before? Could O'Connell have had anything to do with that?
Right, okay. There are a couple of stages. First of all, in '74, you've got the Rabat resolution that declares the PLO the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That isn't the end of the Jordanian claim on the West Bank. Hussein formally has to defer to this, but he still is the preferred negotiating partner. The United States, for the Israelis, everybody would rather be dealing with King Hussein than the PLO. Roll the clock forward, and we're on to 1988, which I think is the junction you're talking about, July '88, where he severs administrative ties with the West Bank. What's happened in the intervening sort of decade and a half is he's tried by various different routes to see if he can secure a deal over the West Bank which will involve what he understands to have been the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 242. In other words, minor reciprocal, border rectifications. If you could have got the West Bank back on that basis, then I think a deal could have been done right after the '67 war. But that deal on that basis was never on the table. The most the Israelis would offer would be the Lon Plan, which involved them retaining, a portion of the territory of the West Bank, which was more than the kind of minor border rectifications that Hussein was talking about. So, in essence, what happened by 1988 was he just got frustrated. He tried to deal with the situation one way or another. He talked to the Israelis a lot. He talked to the Americans a lot. He talked to the PLO a lot. He tried to bring the PLO in. That was the thrust of his diplomacy through the 80s. And I think by the time he got to '88, it had all just kind of run into the sand. He couldn't see any other way forward, so he announced this severing of administrative ties with the West Bank. Did it date all the way back to 1967? No, really. I don't think it would be awkward to draw a simple line between those two. I think you had to go through 2 decades of frustration and failed diplomacy before you got to '88.
Thank you.
Sorry I had to be just a little late, but I was especially interested in your talk because I had some distinct personal memories from my late father, who was the deputy chief of mission in Amman at the embassy during the war. Adams was his name.
Ah, right.
And the one recollection which may have something to fit in with some of the things you say about Hussein's perception. Was he said that after the attack, he was called to the palace, and Hussein was absolutely livid and enraged because he said that according to their radar, they had seen the Israeli planes taking off from the American aircraft carriers. And my father just sort of enjoyed recalling that he told Hussein, no, the explanation was that Israeli planes had flown at sea level and then popped up right where the carriers were and come back. So I don't know if that had anything to do with what Hussein's sources were for knowing about the attack.
This is the so-called big lie, the claim that the United States and Britain gets thrown into the mix as well, and somehow participated even in the Israeli attack. And O'Connell had an interesting account on this as well. I mean, I don't know whether your father was in the same meeting as him or not, but he said he was called to the King's mother's home on, I think he said, the second day of the war, and shown, there was like a movie projector and everything set up, and they were shown these radar images of the Israelis with them appearing to attack from Egypt, from out over the sea, if you like, from the west rather than the east. And he asked O'Connell for an explanation, and O'Connell's response was, well, I'm not a military man, I can't give you an explanation, but I'll get people out from Washington to explain this to you, which they duly did. They sent a couple of technicians out who worked through this all with him, and, shortly after the war, Hussein was prepared to accept that this is what had actually happened. The Israelis had swung out over the sea, and they'd kept low, and that's how they'd carried out the attack. One connection that O'Connell never made, which did kind of trigger in my mind here, well, if it was true that he'd had a warning from the CIA station chief about the Israeli attack, that might well have fed into some notion of conspiracy, because how does the CIA station chief know the Israelis are going to attack? This might well have lent more credence in his mind to this notion that there's some form of American collusion here. I never put that to O'Connell directly, but it's something that did trigger in my mind.
And one other just very more general thing was that I remember my father talking a lot about the influence of Gene Rostow on policy towards the Middle East.
Oh, yes.
And was he directly involved in any of this right around the 67 war?
Yeah, in the aftermath, Rostow was playing quite a significant role. He was another person O'Connell complained about a lot. I mean, there's kind of a hierarchy of people O'Connell complained about. Johnson was top of the list. Second was Henry Kissinger, and that's a different story altogether. That's about 1973. But Rostow came right next after that. And actually, I've done quite a bit of work on the British documents for this period, because the one thing we sometimes tend to forget is that UN Security Council Resolution 242 was a British resolution in the end. Much to the frustration of Ambassador Goldberg, the US representative of the UN. He couldn't get the resolution in the end, and it was the British who came in the last week and put something to, revised it in such a fashion as to get it through. So the British documents on this period are also quite interesting, and they too, interestingly, are full of frustration with Gene Rostow, saying that he's kind of, he's trying to subvert the process of negotiation here, basically. But he was certainly another figure who O'Connell was unhappy about.
You need to use the microphone, otherwise we...
Complaint shared by other U.S. diplomats in the area. The charge was that Rostow shared all the communications from the embassy with the Israelis.
Yeah.
Okay. Who hasn't spoken up yet? I want to at least make sure everybody has... Okay, good. Then we can go back to Red Austin. Michael.
On your remembrance of this, I used to brief Gene Rostow every morning, and I found him a very sweet and likable man, but an intellectual butterfly, and so forth. But I did have one good experience concerning him. He had a very good relationship with the Iranian ambassador, and they used to meet in his office and schmooze and this and that and the other thing. And he was quite frank with the Iranian. But what he didn't seem to realize was that the Israelis were reading this traffic. No doubt we were reading this traffic. The Russians were still reading it. And I don't know how I found out about this. except, oh, I know, it was the NSA people who came and said, do you know that this is going on? And I told Tom Hughes about it, who then was head of INR, and he said, why don't you just go up and have a little talk with Gene? And I did tell Rostow that, do you realize that these conversations are being read sort of by God and everybody, and you should be careful, and so forth and so on. And if a junior person may, I've never talked in this, what's the word I want? This forum before, because, well, most of the people here are eminent historians and I'm not. But you have to give me one more 30-second break. Oh, yes. In 1967, an Israeli delegation came over. This was the time of the Elan Plan, an Israeli delegation with a very nice guy named Moshe Bitan, very, very sweet guy. And he was defending the Elan Plan and so forth and so on. And, excuse me again, and said, you know, we really don't want any territory, hold any territory along the Jordan River. We just want to put a few tanks down there. And I said, no tanks, but no territory. And I said, when did Jews begin to believe in what's the word? What's the term?
Well, I think the point comes across in any case, but
well, I'll come up with it and I'll write you
all right, very good. Thank you. Any other questions? I think Stan Falk had one too. Hold on, wait for the microphone, please.
You were talking about the Egyptians being essentially in a defensive configuration, talking about the ground troops being still in Yemen, etc. According to Michael Oren, the Israelis were concerned about the Egyptian Air Force, that the Egyptian Air Force were going to strike, and that if the Israelis could not knock that out initially, all might be lost. And this is a key factor. Oren describes, as you know, a very contentious discussion in the Israeli government about what they're going to do, should they do it, et cetera, as you've alluded.
Yeah, I think the other, I mean, to me, Oren's book is a good book, but also I think the best one I've read on the Israeli side of '67 is Tom Segev's book. What Segev does extremely effectively is show that there was the kind of the mood of Israel in 1967 was leading up to the war was one of lack of confidence. You know, the economy was in trouble. If you like, the person on the street felt threatened, encircled. But what Segev does extremely well is contrast that with the views of a small number of individuals in the military and intelligence establishment who, when they looked at the configuration of forces, actually saw the situation as an opportunity. In other words, that here was a chance, because of the situation Nasser had put himself in, to deal with Israel's longer-term strategic business. Now, there's a big contrast between that and how most people in Israel are feeling. Most people look on it as like, you know, we're under threat, we're encircled. But there are, let's say, Emmett, Diane, people like that saw the situation somewhat differently. And, of course, it was crucial, if you were going to do that, to deal with the Egyptian Air Force first. It was absolutely vital that you would take the initiative and deal with the Air Force, because that was where, if there was any kind of threat, it was the Egyptian Air Force, and that was the first thing that had to be dealt with. So yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying.
You haven't said anything about the Russians. And their role. As I recall, just a few days before the start of the war, they pulled their dependents out of there, which seems to me was sort of a giveaway that they knew that the Egyptians were going to attack.
I mean, there's a lot of controversy about the Soviet role leading up to the 1967 war. I mean, I'm not a Soviet specialist, but I have followed it with interest. you get kind of a contrast between Isabella Guinor's position and Galia Golan's position. You've got Guinor on one side, Guinor and Remers on one side, trying to assemble evidence to show that the Soviet Union had aggressive intentions in the Middle East in 1967, and their thesis is in essence that the Soviets were trying to provoke a situation in which the Israelis would launch a first strike, and that the Soviets would use this to destroy the Israeli military, atomic capacity.
Like spats over Dimona.
Yeah, exactly. They're very dear friends. You can tell I'm about to disagree when I say that first. They're dear friends. I invited them to a conference. They've spoken. They've written in a book. But I have to say, I don't agree with this thesis. I think they're right to the extent that maybe Soviet intentions were less clear-cut than we thought they were in 1967. Galia Golan originally wrote about this as essentially no more than a purely defensive strategy. They were maybe interested in warm water ports and so forth, but they didn't want to provoke a war. That was a disaster for them. That may have been a little bit too cautious in its interpretation of Soviet policy, but I regard this thesis of, the Soviets were deliberately trying to provoke a war through the false intelligence report, and then when the war broke out, they would use it to destroy Dimona. I'm afraid I think it's just a bit too clever by half. It makes, the Soviets look like kind of supernatural string pullers in this situation. So I come back, as you might expect, with the paper I've just given, that if any superpower matters, it's the United States, because in Israel, the legacy of 1956, the recollection of what had happened in 1956, where they'd been forced to withdraw under threat even of economic sanctions from the Eisenhower administration, that couldn't be allowed to happen again. Now, all right, they thought Johnson was a different president in terms of his outlook than Eisenhower had been, but they wanted to be a bit more sure about it than that. So to me, the American posture is of the two superpowers, the American posture is the one that matters more.
Which nicely brings me to probably the final question. What's the relevance of this episode for today? What do you make of
Well, I've got one simple argument about relevance. We're still trying to solve these problems, aren't we? The legacy of 1967, we're all still grappling with huge frustration all around these situations. Everybody seems to think they know what the settlement should look like, but no one can actually find a way to it. Maybe that was, I think, King Hussein's experience for across the bulk of the rest of his reign, feeling like a settlement was somehow both within reach and out of reach the whole time. In terms of O'Connell's personal role, I don't know whether you could have, well, again, maybe people in the room can correct me or whatever, but it was a remarkable combination of roles, and I'd be surprised if someone could come up with that same kind of combination in future. He did have unique access in 3 different roles across an extended period of time. I think the other thing I draw out of it is, we're writing history of key events, but we're still missing an awful lot of evidence, even for something like 1967 that's been studied an awful lot. While I was here, I went out to the National Archives just to confirm what I already knew, which is that all of the records of military attachés' offices through the 60s are all closed. You can't access any of this stuff. There's no way I can check anything that was coming back from any military attaché other than what got into President Johnson's files. That's where I quoted those few items I quoted you before from the Johnson Library. But I can't check any of this other stuff. It's simply not been processed past the mid-50s. And likewise other sources, intercepts and so forth. Again, at several points in this story, intercepts of Egyptian communications come up. We do know, I think, with a reasonable degree of certainty that the United States was able to read a lot of Egyptian communications. We don't know what they got out of it and what the, we haven't seen any of those records either. So to me, there is an awful lot we still don't know, even about an event like this that's been studied, in great depth.
Well, since you're here at the Cold War Project, and also I think it's very appropriate for the Washington History Seminar as well, I think that I couldn't have wished for a better concluding note. Let me please join me in a round of applause for Nigel.